Good morning. Our assignment today is Psalm 3. It's a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And that preface, which begins Psalm 3, is actually found in the Hebrew canon, the original text. So we know just who wrote this psalm and when he wrote it, which gives us some insight into the psalm itself. And I've entitled it, David Faces Opposition Once Again. Throughout his life, it seemed like David often faced opposition. As a boy, he tended his father's flock, and he faced the opposition of a bear and a lion. Later on, as he became a young man, Samuel came to his house to anoint a new king. David had 7 older brothers who were paraded before Samuel before David was. In fact, David wasn't even there. He was kind of the runt of the family. He was out taking care of the sheep. And those 7 passed by, and Samuel said, "No, God hasn't taken any of these. Isn't there any more?" "Well, yes, there's the youngest, but doubt it's him." But they brought him in, and God said, "Yes, this is the man." And Saul anointed him, and after that, his 7 brothers, probably because of jealousy, kind of turned against him. David then went to live with Saul the king, who turned against him and tried to kill him, and he had to go into exile, live with the Philistines for a while, who later on became his enemies as well. The persecution or opposition that David was facing at this time in his life was because of righteousness, not because of anything wrong that he had done. But later in his life, he faced more trials because of his own sin, because of his sin with Bathsheba and his sin against Uriah, because of strife in his home, because of his polygamous marriages. You see, David had 8 wives and 21 sons, 19 of whom are actually named in Scripture. 2 others, because they died either in infancy or stillborn, are mentioned but not named. And the one we want to consider this morning is Absalom. And in Psalm 3, David said, "Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say, my soul, there is no help for him in God." And I'd like to turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 15. In the Old Testament, it seems to me that things were rather black and white. You knew who your friends were and who your enemies were. David knew the Philistines were his enemies. At this time, his own son Absalom was his enemy. At one time, King Saul was his enemy. But I'm reminded that in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 says, "We wrestle not against flesh and blood." What do we wrestle against? Principalities and powers. Rulers of darkness. Spiritual wickedness. And I have to remind myself, people are not my enemies. Sometimes as a school teacher, you wonder, boy, that student there, I think he's my enemy. No. We're both in this together. We have an enemy of our soul. Satan desires to sift us. We have an enemy. But people are not our enemies. Satan is and his workers. For David, it was more black and white. At this time, Absalom was his enemy. And I'd like to read from 2 Samuel chapter 15, the first 6 verses, which begins by saying, "And it came to pass after this," and I have to stop right there and say, came to pass after what? It came to pass after Absalom had killed his oldest brother, Amnon. I mentioned that David had 21 sons. Absalom was the third of his 21 sons. Amnon was the oldest of David's 21 sons. And Absalom killed him. Amnon was only a half-brother. They had the same father but different mothers to Absalom. And Amnon had raped Tamar, who was Absalom's full sister. He avenged the rape of his sister. And after he killed his oldest brother, he was sent into exile. And through the work, partly of Joab, he eventually was allowed to return to Jerusalem but not see his father. And eventually, through the work of Joab again, he was allowed to come back and see his father. And after this came to pass, Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, "Of what city are you?" And he said, "Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel." And Absalom said unto him, "See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear you." Absalom said, moreover, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice." And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. You'll remember when I read the first two verses from Psalm 3. It says, "How are they increased that trouble me?" David didn't just mention one. He said there's many. They've increased that trouble me. And Absalom had won the hearts of the people. Verse 1 mentioned that Absalom had horses and chariots. But Absalom didn't drive his horses and chariots like Jehu did. Jehu was known for his wild, reckless driving. Absalom evidently drove rather sedately, for he had 50 men that ran before him, before his horses and chariots. Obviously, he had his horses and chariots to make an impression, to make an impressive procession. You see, Absalom was quite the politician. He sensed what the people wanted, and he gave it to them. Samuel had no horses, chariots. Samuel was able to sense what the people wanted, but he didn't want to give it to them. Absalom really isn't even worthy to be mentioned in the same breath as Samuel. Verse 2 tells us that whenever anyone who had a lawsuit would come to the king, he'd be there to meet them. Kings weren't just the head of government in those days, they were also the supreme court. And if you didn't get satisfaction in the lower court, you could go to the king. I'm reminded of Moses in the wilderness. One day his father-in-law Jethro came to visit him there in the wilderness, and he could hardly get a chance to speak to Moses because he was sitting all day judging the people in matters that they'd bring to him. And Jethro, when he finally did get a chance to speak to him, told him that this isn't good. You should appoint others to help you in this work. And Moses said that's good advice and did it. Here, the people are coming to the king, who should appoint representatives. And here's Absalom waiting for them. In verse 3, he said to them, "Your case is good and right. You have a legitimate case here. Unfortunately, there's no deputy to hear your case." So Absalom worked hard as a good politician to stir up dissatisfaction amongst the people. he campaigned against David by promising justice that David supposedly was denying them. In verse 4, he says, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land." Now, Absalom had reason to be disillusioned. After Amnon raped Tamar, David did nothing about it. When Absalom did something about it, he was banished from David's presence. So he had reason to be disillusioned. And verse 5 says, whenever anyone came near to do obeisance, to bow to him, he'd put forth his hand and he'd lift them up and he'd hug and kiss them. He wanted to be recognized as a man of the people. He wouldn't let others bow to him. Though probably he didn't consider himself to be a man of the people. He acted better than others. He acted above the law. And he knew that he was better looking than others. He knew he was better connected than others. He knew he was better off financially. He knew, too, that he had better political instincts than others. And unfortunately, in ancient Israel, people were too easily impressed by the image rather than the reality. And I'd like to say that here in the United States today, that's no longer true. Unfortunately, it's probably even more true today than it was in ancient Egypt. I'm teaching ancient Egypt, ancient Israel, where men were more impressed by image than by reality. In verse 6, Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He actually became more popular than his father David, and probably even more trusted. And he knew exactly how to do it, and he accomplished it. He cultivated his image with his horses and chariots and the 50 men that ran before him. Verse 2 tells us that he worked hard at it too. He would rise up early in the morning, and he would position himself in the right place at the right time, beside the way to the gate. And he would look for troubled people, anyone who had a lawsuit, anyone who had a grievance, and he would reach out to them. He'd call unto them. He took a personal interest. What city are you from? He sympathized with them. Your case, he said, is good and right. He didn't attack David directly. He just said, "There's no deputy to hear you. Oh, that I were made judge. Things would be different." He was able to subvert the people with nothing specific against him. He hadn't done anything wrong. If anything, he was helping David deal with the discontent. And people were becoming dissatisfied with David. For one thing, he was getting older. Another thing, his sins, David's sins, diminished his standing. Absalom represented change, exciting change. Absalom was skilled and cunning. And another thing that the Old Testament tells us is that David had to enter into the fellowship of his suffering. So perhaps this was part prophecy being fulfilled. In verse 7, which I didn't read, it says that it came to pass after 40 years. I don't think that Absalom actually spent 40 years at the gate stirring the people up against David. I think it might mean that at this point Absalom was 40 years old, and other translations actually say 4 years. In any event, after a time, he asked to be able to go and keep a promise that he had made before God in Hebron. And David told him to go. And he was actually going to prepare now, not only had the people on his side, to overthrow his father David. And he went there to Hebron and prayed. You know, divisive people like Absalom never see themselves as divisive. Instead, they see themselves as crusaders for God's cause. And it's quite possible that he believed the hand of God was upon him. And it's quite possible he prayed, Lord, you know that we need new leadership. And I thank you for raising me up for just such a time as this. Guide me now and bless me as I endeavor to do what's best. Let's go back to Psalm 3. The events of Psalm 3 are in 2 Samuel, which I just read. But the heart of David is in Psalm 3. And I'll read verses 1 and 2 again. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Stop and think on that. Selah. This is what those who troubled David did. Verses 1 and 2, they increased. Many had been David's friends in the past. And they were saying now that there's no help for him in God. I think they knew that God could help anyone in any situation. But I think what they were saying is, God's going to be unwilling to help him. He's getting what he deserves here. An example is Shimei. As David was fleeing, he passed by a certain town, and Shimei came out. And he cursed David and called him a bloody man. And he threw stones at him and his entourage. And one of Joab's men, I forget his name, said, how about I just go over and lop his head off with my sword? And David said, no, it's okay. Let him be. This thought must have been most painful to David. Mephibosheth even turned against him, who David had shown such kindness to him. And one of Mephibosheth's servants met David. He had come on his own with a gift to David. And David said, well, where's Mephibosheth? Well, he's waiting in Jerusalem thinking that maybe the kingdom will be restored to him now, since he's a direct descendant of Saul. And David refused to take the gift. Many there be, how they are increased that trouble me. Verse 3 and 4. Verse 3 begins with just a little short word, 3-letter word, but. But you know what? That word right there is a very big one. It signifies a change, a switch. Many there be that are against me, but you, O Lord, are a shield for me. You're my glory and the lifter of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Stop and think on that. Selah. This is what God did for David in the midst of his trouble. David's confidence in God could not be shaken at this time. And I don't see David praying here and saying, God, I need help. I need a shield. I need you to be my shield and protector and deliverer. No, his confidence was greater than that. He said, you, Lord, are my shield. David did not lose confidence in God. He said, you are my glory. You are the one who's going to lift up my head. This is not a prayer. This is a strong declaration. And I'm challenged by this, because at times I've often felt like I had someone who was oppressing me, or something that was oppressing me. Depressed? I'm ashamed to say it, but there's times that I've lacked confidence. And I'm challenged by David's faith here. He didn't lack confidence. He knew that God was still there and was going to take care of him. My glory and the one who lifts my head. The one who put David on higher ground. You know, men glory in a lot of things, like Absalom. He gloried in fame. He gloried in power, prestige, possessions. But David found his glory in the Lord. And in verse 4, he says, I cried to the Lord with my voice. Silent prayers are heard too. But men often find their prayers better when they pray aloud, even when they're alone. He heard me from his holy hill. Others said that God wanted nothing to do with David. But David said, he heard me, and he helped me from his holy hill. Verses 5 and 6 show how God blessed David at this time. David says in verse 5, I laid me down and slept. Even with all that was going on, David was able to lay down and sleep. There's times that I haven't been able to do that. Or there's times that I get awake about 2 in the morning and can't get back to sleep, thinking about things. Usually they get much bigger. I make mountains out of molehills. In the morning they look a lot worse. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. David was able to lay down at this time and sleep. Verse 5. He said, I laid me down and slept, and I awaked. For the Lord sustained me. When we're asleep, we're pretty much dead to the world. We're unconscious. Yet during that time that we're asleep, we still breathe. Our heart still beats. Our organs still operate. And the same God that sustains us while we're asleep also sustains us in our difficulties. Sometimes we need to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Just keep going, knowing that God is our shield and that he is going to deliver us. David goes on further to say in verse 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. And I'm reminded of Romans chapter 8, verse 31, where Paul said, if God be for us, who can be against us? Finally, in verses 7 and 8, David blesses God. He says, arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheek. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah. Stop and think again. Verse 7, arise, O Lord, and save me. It was actually a military term that was used by Moses in the wilderness, as God was to rise up before them again and lead them in the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. Arise, O Lord, David said, and save me, O my God. It says furthermore that he has broken the teeth of his enemies. David didn't just want protection. David knew he was going to get more than just protection. He wasn't going to have to leave his kingdom and go into exile. He knew that victory was coming. It isn't just enough to survive. But as Christians, we need victory. And salvation belongs to the Lord. To be saved, one has to deal with the Lord. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. David wasn't just concerned for himself. He was also concerned for God's people. Perhaps, I've been doing all the talking, perhaps someone has some thoughts or something they'd like to share. A testimony. I'd like to conclude then by going back to verse 3. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me. You indeed are my glory and the lifter of my head. And that's my testimony. There's been times where I've hardly felt like I could put one foot in front of the other anymore. But God sustained me. He's been my shield through all those times. He's been my glory and the lifter of mine head. On my own strength, I realize I can do nothing. But thanks be to God, who can do all things through us. I thank you for your attention, and I pray God's blessing upon you. Thank you.